Macy Brooks had never been the kind of person who attracted attention, and she liked it that way. At 23, she was thoughtful, composed, and quietly resilient, traits that had carried her through the emotional and logistical minefield of working with vulnerable elderly clients as part of a volunteer elder care program. One such client, Miss Adelaide Whitmore, had lived alone in a modest but elegant cottage on the edge of a tight-knit suburban neighborhood. Over the course of the 2 years Macy spent assisting her, their relationship deepened beyond the typical bounds of duty. Miss Whitmore, who had no immediate family left and had grown weary of watching opportunistic relatives hover like vultures from a distance, saw in Macy something different, an honest presence, a young woman who listened more than she spoke, who showed up on time, stayed late, and never once tried to leverage their relationship for personal gain. So, when the older woman passed away after a brief illness, Macy was stunned to discover that Miss Whitmore had left her the house, not in some ambiguous verbal promise or in a scribbled note, but via a legally binding transfer of ownership that had been prearranged and notarized weeks before her death. The process had been conducted quietly and respectfully, with a small-town lawyer, Mr. Dennis Latimer, overseeing the documentation. Miss Whitmore had no illusions about how the neighborhood might react. She had lived there long enough to understand the complex politics and subtle social hierarchies that defined the area. But she had insisted on her decision. The house was to be Macy's, with full rights, without encumbrance. She had even left a sealed letter for her neighbors, explaining that the new resident was not some transient or opportunist, but a friend, a steward of the home, someone she had chosen with intention. It was Macy's first real home. She had spent her early 20s moving between shared apartments and temporary housing, often feeling like a guest in someone else's life. The idea of settling into a place that had walls steeped in memory but still offered space to make her own was both thrilling and daunting. She packed her few belongings, arranged for utility reconnection, and arrived one misty Thursday morning, the front of the house still draped in soft ivy, the porch light flickering faintly like it remembered her. The neighborhood itself was beautiful, the kind of place where sidewalks were swept daily, where hedges were trimmed into tight symmetry, and front doors gleamed under coats of annual polish. It was, to the outsider, idyllic. To Macy, it was a puzzle, one she was eager, if cautiously, to solve. Within hours of her arrival, she sensed the chill. It wasn't overt hostility. No one slammed a door or shouted across the street. Instead, there was a quiet orchestration of distance. A couple walking their golden retriever glanced once and kept their eyes forward. A woman watering her rose bushes abruptly turned off the hose and went inside. Mailboxes were checked and closed with excessive precision whenever she was outside. There was no welcome basket, no knock on the door, no wave from across the fence. Macy tried to tell herself it was all in her head. People were busy, reserved, perhaps wary of newcomers, but the silence began to feel intentional, and the pattern impossible to ignore. 2 days later, she first encountered Karen Kowalski. It was early Saturday morning, and Macy was trimming the overgrown vines near the porch when she heard the sound of heels on concrete. She looked up to see a tall woman in her late 50s standing just beyond the gate. She was dressed like someone who always expected to be seen. Crisp linen trousers, a pale blouse tucked with architectural precision, and a silver pendant that seemed too perfectly centered to be accidental. Her hair was pinned in a low, severe chignon, and her eyes, sharp, watchful, scanned Macy from head to toe before she smiled. "You must be the new tenant," the woman said, not asking but declaring. Macy wiped her hands on her jeans and stood. "I'm Macy Brooks. I live here now." Karen's smile tightened, a subtle but distinct shift. "Ah, I see. This was Adelaide's home. We were close." Macy offered a polite nod, unsure how to respond. She spoke highly of the neighborhood. Karen stepped forward, uninvited, and leaned slightly on the gate. "I'm the head of our local women's council. we take pride in keeping things orderly around here. The residents have expectations. Oh, traditions." "Understood," Macy said carefully. "I plan to take good care of the place." Karen's gaze lingered on the porch, then shifted to the mailbox. "Well, let's hope that includes keeping up with mail and lawn care. That vine looks invasive. And there's a city policy about mailbox decals. Just something to keep in mind." Macy said nothing, unwilling to begin her life in this place with a confrontation. Karen's voice softened, but her posture remained rigid. "If you need anything, or have questions about how things work here, feel free to ask. I always try to help newcomers adjust." "Thank you," Macy said, and Karen turned on her heel without another word. Over the next week, the undercurrent of tension became a quiet, persistent hum. Macy noticed that certain services, trash pickup, for instance, had inexplicably stopped. Her online billing accounts showed active status, but when she called the sanitation company, they claimed the service had been suspended due to non-occupancy. The same thing happened with her internet provider, who informed her they'd received a cancellation order from the homeowner. Macy, confused and growing concerned, had to provide new verification documents each time, some of which had never been requested before. She contacted Mr. Latimer, who reassured her that all legal paperwork had been filed correctly, and that the deed was in her name with full property rights. Still, the interruptions persisted. Then came the garbage incident. She had placed a small bin near the curb the night before collection, as instructed in the city guidelines. The next morning, not only was the trash still there, it had been dumped across her front yard. Torn open, scattered deliberately. As she stood barefoot in the grass, gathering loose pieces of paper and plastic, she saw Karen across the street, standing beside her hydrangeas with a phone in hand and a vague, unreadable expression on her face. She said nothing. Macy didn't wave. That evening, she found a letter in her mailbox with no return address. The envelope was thick, textured, and sealed with a faint smear of lipstick. Inside was a single sentence written in neat, cursive penmanship. "This isn't your home, and everyone knows it." No name, no signature. Just the weight of the words settling in her hands. Macy didn't panic. She didn't call the police, or her mother, or the lawyer, at least not right away. She sat on the back steps of the house, staring out over the modest yard, and asked herself what kind of place punishes someone for simply existing. She had no illusions that fitting in would be easy, but she had also never expected open sabotage. The irony was painful. She had spent years helping people stay in their homes, fight off predators, defend their rights, and now here she was, in a house left to her with love and intention, being made to feel like a squatter. She wasn't going to give in. Not quietly, not passively, and certainly not under pressure. But she knew enough not to play her cards too early. Something deeper was happening here, something organized, calculated, and if she was going to protect herself, she'd need more than good intentions. She'd need clarity, caution, and a very long memory. And so, on the 8th day, when she woke to find a bright yellow notice stapled to her front door stating that an anonymous tip had reported her as an unauthorized occupant and that an investigation was underway, she didn't scream or tear it down. She left it there, quietly documented it, took a photo, called her lawyer. It had begun. Macy didn't sleep the night the notice appeared. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind brush dry leaves across the window screens and wondering who exactly had written the words "unauthorized occupant" in bold block letters. Her lawyer, Dennis Latimer, didn't pick up when she called at dawn, but she left him a detailed voicemail, attaching a photo of the notice and describing how it had been fastened directly into the wood of the front door, an action that, in itself, felt deliberate and invasive. When she checked her email later that morning, she found 2 messages from the City Housing Authority. The first was a standard automated reply acknowledging receipt of a complaint. The second was more alarming. It contained a scheduled time for an in-person verification of lawful occupancy, set for the following day at 10:30 a.m. The message included her name, but listed her property as under review pending identity confirmation, and stated that the inspection would be carried out by a municipal compliance officer accompanied by a field deputy as a precautionary measure. Macy reread it 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. By the time Dennis returned her call, she was pacing the kitchen, phone in one hand, a printed copy of the email in the other. His voice was calm, almost infuriatingly so. He told her not to panic, that property disputes happen more often than people think, and that as long as her paperwork was in order, which it was, she had nothing to worry about. But Macy was less interested in platitudes and more interested in strategy. "What does it mean, Dennis?" she asked. "That I'm under review? Who filed this complaint? Can they actually come inside my house?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Dennis sighed and said, "Technically, if the complaint was framed as a potential squatting situation, they're allowed to verify habitation and identity on site, especially if the complainant used language suggesting abandonment, trespassing, or illegal occupancy. But we'll be ready. I'll be there tomorrow morning with all the relevant documents." True to his word, Dennis arrived 20 minutes early the next day, dressed in a beige suit that clashed with his briefcase but conveyed authority. Macy greeted him with 2 cups of coffee, grateful for his presence. He looked around the house and nodded approvingly. "Well kept, clean, no signs of neglect. This'll go fine," he said, though the lines around his mouth betrayed unease. At precisely 10:26 a.m., a white sedan with government plates pulled up to the curb, followed closely by a marked Sheriff's Department SUV. Macy watched from behind the curtain as 2 men stepped out, one in a gray city-issued jacket with a clipboard tucked under his arm, and the other in a brown uniform with a calm but unreadable face. They didn't approach immediately. Instead, they spoke quietly by the mailbox, glancing at the house and then at the papers in their hands. When they finally approached the door, Dennis answered first. Macy stood behind him in the hallway, trying to still her breathing. The man in the gray jacket introduced himself as Officer Craiglin from the Municipal Compliance Division and said they were responding to a credible and detailed complaint from a named party alleging that a young woman was occupying the residence without authorization or ownership. Craiglin's words were measured but clinical, as if reading from a protocol guide. He requested to see proof of occupancy and legal title. Dennis calmly handed over a folder containing the deed transfer, notarized letters, and a certified copy of the will. As the officer sifted through the pages, the deputy, Sheriff Lyle Wascombe, as his badge read, stood just behind him, one hand resting near his hip, not aggressive but alert. Macy stepped forward only when asked, presenting her ID and confirming her connection to Miss Whitmore. "I worked with her through the Home Assistance Program," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We spent over 2 years together. She named me the recipient of the house in her will, and that was processed legally before she passed." Craiglin didn't question her tone or her story, but neither did he affirm anything. He simply scanned her ID, compared the name to the paperwork, and nodded once. "We'll have to verify these through county records," he said. "We also have to respond to the possibility that the will was contested." Dennis stepped in quickly. "There has been no contest. The transfer was filed and accepted by the county. Everything is in order." It was only after the 2 men left, after they had taken copies and made notes and warned that further review would follow, that Macy allowed herself to feel what had been building since she saw the first yellow notice. Not panic, not exactly. It was rage, controlled, contained, but burning. Someone had not only questioned her right to live in her own home, but had done so with enough detail to launch an investigation. That required effort. That required intention. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a suspicious neighbor making assumptions. This was Karen. Macy hadn't seen her in days, but that evening, while taking out the trash, She noticed her standing at the edge of her perfectly trimmed lawn, pruning a hedge that didn't need pruning. Their eyes met for a moment, and Macy saw it. Just a flicker, a flash of smug calculation behind the smile Karen offered. It was enough to confirm everything. Still, Macy said nothing. She didn't flinch. She closed the lid on her trash bin with deliberate calm and walked back inside without giving Karen the satisfaction of a response. That night, Dennis called with news. The records were still intact, and no one had formally contested the will. But someone had submitted a claim to the city alleging that Miss Whitmore had suffered from mental decline and that the deed transfer had been coerced. The submission was anonymous, but Dennis had managed to obtain a copy through a colleague. The language was familiar. Phrases like preyed upon, unethical manipulation, targeting the elderly, and Macy recognized Karen's cadence in every word. Dennis warned that the next step would likely involve a social services inquiry, since the complaint had triggered a secondary review with Adult Protective Services. They're obligated to investigate potential elder abuse in cases where inheritance or property transfer is involved, he explained, even if the complaint comes after the fact. Macy could hardly believe it. She had built her career, her entire moral framework, on the principle of protecting those very people. To be accused of exploiting someone she had loved and respected felt not just insulting, but surreal. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She went to her desk, opened her laptop, and began assembling her own dossier. Letters from the program, photographs of her time with Miss Whitmore, records of scheduled visits, notes left by Adelaide herself in the margins of crossword books, and calendars. Evidence not for the public, not for the press, but for whatever bureaucrat next decided to question her integrity. And while she worked, she began to notice something else. Subtle shifts in the way her environment reacted to her presence. The corner store clerk, who once greeted her with a neutral nod, now barely looked her in the eye. The post office employee who had chatted with her during her first week now handed her mail in silence. The neighbor who once waved from the second floor of the duplex across the street no longer opened his blinds. Macy understood. In a community where perception mattered more than proof, rumors spread like wildfire, especially when they came from someone like Karen, whose years in the neighborhood had turned her into a figure of quiet influence. She didn't need a badge. She didn't need a title. All she had to do was suggest something and people would listen. It was in that atmosphere, taut, silent, disapproving, that the second official notice arrived. This time it was a letter, formal and printed on city letterhead, informing Macy that the complaint had escalated into a full administrative review of the property's legal status, and that until the review was concluded, the occupant's residency is to be considered provisional. The language was careful, legalistic, and deeply unsettling. Dennis assured her again that her claim was solid, that the complaint lacked evidence, and that the process, though stressful, would resolve in her favor. But Macy had stopped hoping for swift resolutions. She understood now that someone was trying to dislodge her, not through force, not through law, but through exhaustion. And she also understood that if she didn't brace herself, if she didn't outlast this pressure, she could lose everything that had been freely and lovingly given to her. The storm had begun to gather, and Macy knew better than to wait for lightning to strike. She started preparing not for a battle, but for a siege. By the second week, Macy realized that the campaign to push her out was no longer an exercise in subtlety. It had evolved into a series of orchestrated obstructions, each one designed not only to inconvenience but to isolate, unsettle, and ultimately undermine her right to remain. What began as a quiet psychological siege was now becoming bureaucratic and social warfare. Her name appeared on a municipal file tagged with a provisional status that even Dennis, despite all his legal experience, admitted was a gray zone meant for legal limbo. This meant that while the house remained legally hers, she could not receive certain services tied to confirmed property registration, homeowner tax credits, minor utilities rebates, and, more worryingly, any official certification from the city that the home met occupancy standards. And without occupancy certification, she could not, under zoning laws, perform any structural repairs, request street maintenance, or engage in any official updates to her address. Essentially, she was legal on paper but untouchable in function. Dennis filed an official appeal, but appeals required time. Weeks. And time was exactly what Karen counted on wearing down. One morning, Macy woke to find a handwritten flyer stuffed through her mail slot. There was no return address, no official logo, just bold red marker ink across the top that read, "Attention, residents. Know who's living among you." The rest of the paper was a poorly formatted series of accusations framed as questions. Was this young woman named in the original neighborhood deed map? Is she legally competent to inherit? What happens when the city discovers fraud? Each line designed to seed doubt without taking responsibility for a direct claim. It wasn't clever, but it was effective. The next day, the local neighborhood bulletin board outside the town hall had a copy of the flyer pinned alongside notices for piano recitals and lost cats. Dennis urged Macy to stay calm, but she had reached a point where calm felt like complicity. She had done everything right, legally, ethically, personally, and yet every corner she turned, someone was working to smear her, to redefine her story. The insult wasn't just in the lies, it was in how easily they were accepted. The city might have remained officially neutral, but on the ground, Macy was being quietly erased from the narrative of the neighborhood. At the corner cafe, her drink order was forgotten 3 days in a row. At the public library, her reserved books were inexplicably missing from inventory. When she walked down the sidewalk, conversations stopped. Not violently, not dramatically, just with the seamless rhythm of exclusion, the kind that doesn't make headlines but cuts just as deeply. Things came to a head the afternoon she found the backyard gate open and the lock snapped. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing was broken. But someone had clearly entered the property without permission. It had rained the night before, and Macy noticed boot prints in the mud, 3 distinct tracks leading to the rear shed, which had been partially pried open. Inside, everything remained intact, but the intrusion was unmistakable. She reported it to the sheriff's department. An officer came out, took a few photos, filled out a standard incident report, and left with the vague promise to keep an eye on things. But Macy saw the look in his eyes, the restrained curiosity, the slight impatience. To him, she was just a name on a controversial file, the young woman whose residency was still under review. She wasn't fully real to them yet. She was a question mark wrapped in paperwork. That night, Macy moved a chair into the front hallway and sat facing the door for hours. Not because she expected another break-in, but because the entire concept of security had shifted. It no longer meant locked doors or motion sensors. It meant knowing that if someone targeted her again, she wouldn't be the one who had to prove she didn't deserve it. She was tired of being reduced to a burden of proof. Dennis, sensing her mental fatigue, suggested she temporarily stay elsewhere, just until the situation de-escalated. Macy refused. The house wasn't just a physical space. It was a statement, a piece of history that had been entrusted to her. If she left, she wouldn't just be conceding ground to Karen. She'd be erasing the final intent of a woman who had deliberately chosen her. Adelaide had known this might happen. In one of her final notes, a letter Macy had found taped under the kitchen sink, she had written, "If they try to say you don't belong, remember they said the same to me when I moved in 40 years ago. Some places take longer to soften." But Macy had no time for softening. The next development was more invasive than anything before. A letter from the county tax office indicating a review had been initiated regarding back taxes allegedly owed on the property. Macy knew this was impossible. The taxes had been prepaid by Adelaide for the following year as part of the transition plan, a fact confirmed by Dennis during their initial filings. But the letter claimed discrepancies in the amounts listed and warned that continued occupancy without proper settlement of liabilities could result in liens or forfeiture proceedings. Dennis nearly lost his composure when she forwarded him the letter. This is beyond targeted. It's systemic interference. Someone in the local office is feeding this nonsense into the system, and we need to stop it now. He filed a formal complaint with the county, attached all receipts, and requested an audit of the tax office's recent transactions. It would take time, again. But the tone had changed. Even Dennis, cautious and measured by nature, was beginning to see this not as a local misunderstanding, but as a coordinated effort to harass. That night, Macy turned off the lights and sat in the dark with the window cracked just enough to hear the night sounds. She listened to the far-off rattle of a distant train, the occasional dog bark, and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. Then, at 2:17 a.m., she heard it, a metallic scrape against the porch railing. She stood slowly, barefoot, her pulse hammering in her ears. When she opened the door, no one was there, but taped to the screen was another note, written in the same cursive as before. "You've been warned. Walk away while you still can." Macy didn't cry. She didn't scream. She took the note inside, laid it on the table next to her growing pile of evidence, and wrote the time and date in the corner. She then called Dennis and left a message. "It's escalating. We need more than forms now." By morning, Dennis had arranged for a consultation with a private investigator he trusted, a former state compliance officer named Letitia Brandt. Letitia was sharp, skeptical, and unimpressed by theatrics. After reviewing the materials, she said flatly, "This isn't just a smear. It's a campaign. Someone with local access is feeding data upstream to create enough doubt to collapse your legitimacy from within." Macy asked her if it could be Karen. Letitia gave her a look. "No amateur is pulling records from the tax office without help. Karen might be the face, but someone else is opening doors behind her." That changed everything. Macy had been imagining Karen as the sole architect of her torment, an angry neighbor with too much time and influence. But now she understood. Karen might have been the match, but someone else had brought the gasoline. Letitia didn't promise miracles. She didn't even promise a swift resolution. But she did offer clarity. "We'll map the chain," she said. "Follow the signatures. There's always a paper trail when someone uses government systems to play personal games." Macy felt something crack open inside her. Not relief exactly, but traction. Finally, someone wasn't just telling her to wait. They were acting. And action, even cautious and quiet, felt like a revolution. The final straw came the following weekend when a local reporter left a business card wedged under her windshield. Macy hadn't spoken to the press. She hadn't given interviews or posted anything online. But someone, likely Karen, had leaked the existence of the city's investigation, spinning it as a neighborhood dispute over possible fraud in inheritance. The article, published 2 days later in a small Sunday paper, didn't mention Macy by name, but the house was identifiable. Phrases like "a young outsider," "sudden property transfer," and "concerned residents" painted the picture Karen wanted. The comments section exploded with speculation. Macy stayed offline. Instead, she met with Letitia and Dennis in her living room and handed them copies of every letter, every note, every flyer and photo she had collected. She told them, in the clearest voice she could muster, "I'm not leaving. I don't care what they throw at me. This house is mine, and I'm done playing defense." Letitia looked at Dennis. Dennis nodded slowly. And just like that, the war stopped being silent. Letitia's investigation began with the County Property Records Office, where she cross-referenced Macy's title with other recent transfers in the neighborhood. What she found was a series of inconsistencies so subtle they would have slipped past anyone not specifically looking. Files with metadata showing edits made outside of regular working hours, several digital documents logged under the names of clerks, who were on scheduled leave, and in one case a scanned page with a signature that, upon close inspection, didn't match the verified handwriting of the person whose name was attached. While Letitia worked, Macy resumed her everyday routines as best she could, but there was an edge to everything now, an invisible tension that shadowed even her most mundane actions. She would reach for the mailbox and hesitate, unsure whether she'd find more flyers or anonymous threats. She would walk into the local grocery store and feel the pause in the cashier's voice when they asked, "Paper or plastic?" The walls of her house were intact, but the boundaries of her life were being chipped away. One cautious glance and whispered, "Rumor at a time." One afternoon, Letitia returned with a new piece of information. "I found the link," she said without ceremony. "There's a clerk in the zoning department. Name's Travis Dorn. He signed off on the freeze notice for your property the same day your name was scrubbed from the occupancy ledger." Macy blinked. "But I've never met him." Letitia nodded. "You wouldn't have to. But guess who has a standing lunch reservation with him every other Wednesday?" She placed a photo on the table. There was Karen, unmistakable in her pastel blazer and pearl earrings, seated across from a man in a county employee badge at a corner table of the city's municipal building cafe. The timestamp was 2 days before the first notice had appeared on Macy's door. Letitia wasn't smiling. She didn't just call in a complaint. She orchestrated the entire procedural net. Macy sat still for a long time, the photo burning into her mind. There was a particular cruelty in Karen's style of warfare, not loud or dramatic, but strategic, using tools designed for governance to erode someone's life. And there was nothing hypothetical about it. This wasn't the theoretical injustice of a broken system. This was targeted, personal, and real. Dennis, sitting across the room, ran a hand down his face. "We can challenge it," he said. "We file a procedural misconduct claim, push for an internal audit of the zoning office, and request a temporary injunction to lift the freeze. But it'll get attention, media attention. Are you ready for that?" Macy didn't answer right away. She looked around the room, the small couch where Adelaide used to nap, the coffee table where they once played cards, the bookshelf still stacked with the older woman's dog-eared mystery novels, and she nodded. "I don't care if it's public. I care that it ends." The next step was to confront the source. Letitia drafted a formal complaint citing administrative manipulation and abuse of municipal influence. Dennis accompanied her to the city administrator's office where they presented evidence: the lunch meeting, the edited files, the irregular freeze notice, and a sequence of suspicious activity logs tied directly to Dorn's access credentials. The administrator's reaction was quiet but swift. An internal review was launched, and Travis Dorn was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The administrator assured them the freeze would be lifted temporarily while the matter was resolved. It was the first real victory Macy had felt since the ordeal began. But it didn't come without consequences. That evening, a neighborhood watch group, one Macy didn't even know existed, circulated a flyer with a bold headline: "Interference with Civic Procedures. A Threat to Our Community." It framed the suspension of Dorn as a politically motivated attack, and suggested that certain individuals with outside influence were attempting to destabilize a historically peaceful neighborhood. The flyer didn't name Macy, but everyone knew. Her mailbox was overflowing again, this time with passive-aggressive leaflets praising traditional neighborhood values and inviting residents to attend a special meeting hosted at Karen's home. Macy didn't attend the meeting. She stayed home, reading the same page of Adelaide's favorite novel over and over again. Her focus shattered. But Letitia went. Disguised as a real estate consultant, she sat quietly at the back of Karen's living room while neighbors sipped tea and nibbled scones. Karen spoke with theatrical concern, lamenting the divisiveness that had gripped the community. She spoke of respect for the past, preserving heritage, and guarding the gate from those who would exploit goodwill. She never said Macy's name. She didn't have to. Every word was a code, a nudge, a whisper in the ear of the people already primed to doubt. Letitia recorded everything. 2 days later, Macy received a formal letter from the city clerk's office acknowledging that her occupancy status had been restored and that her deed remained in good standing. The language was professional, but Macy read between the lines. The city was walking back its stance not because it suddenly supported her, but because it had been caught looking complicit. It was a technical vindication, but it didn't undo the damage. Her reputation in the neighborhood had been sliced into rumors and half-truths, and there was no erasing that. She understood now that even winning would not feel like peace. But then came the letter, hand-delivered, unsigned, placed gently at her front door in a plain white envelope. Inside was a single sentence. "She's done this before." No return address, no further explanation. Macy brought it to Letitia, who began checking prior incidents involving Karen, cross-referencing real estate filings, police logs, and public complaints. A pattern emerged, not perfectly clear, but undeniable. In 3 other cases over the past 10 years, homes that were vacated due to death or elder illness had seen delayed sales, contested inheritances, or sudden transfer issues. In each case, the original occupants had no family, and in 2 of the 3, Karen had been listed as a community liaison, assisting with transitional housing. Letitia couldn't prove involvement, not directly, but the rhythm was too perfect. "She waits," Letitia said. "She watches. And when someone vulnerable occupies a house she thinks doesn't belong, she makes it unlivable. Quietly, efficiently, until they either leave or collapse." Macy didn't feel fear anymore. She felt purpose. Adelaide hadn't just given her a house. She'd unknowingly armed her with the tools to expose a sickness beneath the neighborhood's polite exterior. She wasn't just defending her home anymore. She was holding a line that Karen had crossed one too many times. And now that the freeze was lifted, she had leverage. She called Dennis and Letitia to her home and laid out a plan. File a motion to request formal testimony from Karen regarding her complaints, compel her to disclose any affiliation with Dorn or other city employees, and move to open a civil inquiry into her role in obstructing property rights. Letitia warned her, "If we do this, it becomes a war. She'll retaliate." Macy answered simply, "She already has. I'm just done pretending it's not happening." And in that moment, surrounded by stacks of evidence, recorded conversations, restored documents, and years of Adelaide's belongings that told a story Karen could never rewrite, Macy felt the scales tip. Not toward safety or forgiveness, but toward clarity. This wasn't about belonging anymore. It was about making sure no one else would ever have to fight this kind of battle in silence again. Macy had crossed a line, but it wasn't one of aggression. It was a threshold of self-preservation, a moment in which she accepted that no amount of patience or decency would insulate her from the full breadth of Karen's tactics. Now that the administrative freeze was lifted and her deed reaffirmed, the next layer of resistance revealed itself with unnerving speed. On the surface, things appeared calmer. Her utilities functioned without interruption. No new flyers appeared on the bulletin board, and the city ceased sending inquiries. But underneath that thin layer of quiet, something shifted, something colder, more personal. Macy began to notice that her mail was late, often crumpled or partially opened. Her online purchases were marked as delivered, yet never arrived. And twice she discovered that scheduled appointments, once with a tree service company, once with a cleaning crew, had been mysteriously canceled, with neither provider able to explain who made the call. Letitia warned her that this was the next phase: logistical erosion. If Karen could no longer attack her through institutional channels, she would pivot to community pressure, discrediting Macy through accumulated inconvenience and orchestrated rumors, hoping to grind her down by turning daily life into a series of small, exhausting fights. Then came the health inspection. A white truck bearing the city emblem arrived on a Wednesday morning without warning. A man in a city-issued vest approached the house, clipboard in hand, and asked Macy to step outside. He explained with the sterile tone of someone just following orders that an anonymous complaint had been submitted citing health code violations, specifically improper storage of waste, rodent activity, and possible hoarding behavior. Macy nearly laughed. The lawn was immaculate, the trash bins sealed, and the interior of the home was clean enough to resemble a model showroom. She invited the inspector in without hesitation. As he walked through the living room, kitchen, and bedrooms, he began to look increasingly uncomfortable, as though he knew the visit was a formality designed to intimidate rather than investigate. He left without issuing a citation, but the message was clear. The campaign wasn't over, it had simply changed form. Dennis followed up with the city's environmental office and managed to obtain a copy of the original complaint. It was short but specific, alleging that the resident had been observed piling bags of garbage in the backyard, and included an attached photo, grainy, obviously taken at night, and clearly doctored. It showed the rear of the house with black shapes that could have been trash bags, but were more likely shadows or edited images. Letitia cross-referenced the image's metadata and traced it back to an IP address registered to the local historical society's public network, which, unsurprisingly, listed Karen as its vice chair. They couldn't prove she uploaded it, but the chain of connection tightened. That weekend, Macy attended a local community forum, a small gathering held in the town square under the pretense of discussing park renovations. She sat quietly in the back, taking notes, watching as Karen stood up midway through the session and casually redirected the conversation toward the importance of preserving community values in the face of shifting demographic patterns. It was an unmistakable jab. Karen spoke of outsiders exploiting kindness, loopholes in inheritance, and the responsibility of residents to remain vigilant. Macy didn't respond. She didn't need to. Letitia was in the crowd, recording the entire speech. Afterwards, she approached the podium under the guise of introducing herself as a researcher studying community dynamics. She asked Karen if she could speak with her privately sometime to gather insight into how neighborhoods manage disputes. Karen agreed, oblivious to the trap. Letitia met with her 3 days later at a cafe on the outskirts of town. She asked pointed but neutral questions, and Karen, confident in her local status and unthreatened by someone she believed to be an outsider, became increasingly candid. She spoke of setting boundaries before rot takes hold, of preventing decay, of how people like that girl move in with no history, no roots, no sense of what this place stands for. Letitia never mentioned Macy by name. She didn't have to. Karen's tone grew sharper, more triumphant, and then she said it. If she thinks a few signatures and an old woman's will are enough to make her one of us, she's in for a rude awakening. Some things you can't inherit. You earn them, or you don't belong. Letitia ended the conversation soon after, thanking her for her time, and walked out with enough on tape to solidify a pattern of targeted hostility. But it still wasn't over. The next escalation was economic. Macy received a notice from her bank indicating that her mortgage insurance coverage had lapsed. It made no sense. Her property had been gifted to her outright, with no debt attached. When she contacted the bank, they explained that a third-party property assessor had recently reclassified her home as at risk, which triggered an automatic update in their risk profile systems. Macy was stunned. Letitia dove into the records and found the trigger. An assessment request filed by someone using the name J. Marins, claiming to be a concerned property co-owner. The bank had accepted it at face value. It took Dennis a week to reverse the designation and reestablish the property's clean title status. But in that time, Macy's home was flagged in multiple databases as part of an unclear ownership chain, which resulted in temporary freezes on her insurance coverage, online accounts, and even her utilities auto-pay. Letitia described it as a digital smear campaign, where official systems were weaponized with forged documentation to slowly push her toward financial instability. It was, in effect, administrative gaslighting. No single action was strong enough to evict her. No complaint was serious enough to warrant law enforcement. But taken together, they created an atmosphere of constant instability, where the ground shifted beneath her every morning, and she had to spend hours regaining footing, resolving a false cancellation, disputing a form she never submitted, calling a vendor to reestablish a service she never turned off. Macy stopped sleeping. Her hands trembled during phone calls. Her voice, once steady, cracked with fatigue even when speaking simple sentences. And yet, she didn't leave. Every morning, she made coffee. She swept the porch. She trimmed the hedges. She answered every letter with documented proof. She refused to give Karen the victory of seeing her crumble. But the final straw came not in a letter or a visit, but in a conversation overheard at the post office. Macy was standing in line when two older women behind her began discussing the girl in the Whitmore house. They spoke in hushed tones, assuming she couldn't hear. One of them said she heard Macy had snapped, that she'd been seen yelling at no one in the backyard. Another said she heard the sheriff was keeping an eye on her. A third, joining in, wondered aloud if she had coerced the old woman, and perhaps she was under investigation. None of it was true. But Macy stood there, frozen, while they dissected her like she wasn't present. She left the post office without collecting her mail, walked home and stood for nearly 10 minutes on her front steps, keys in hand, unable to move. She called Letitia. "I want it public," she said. "Everything. The recordings, the letters, the false reports. I want it all exposed." Letitia paused. "It will get messy." "I'm already living in a mess," Macy replied. "I just want the truth to have a louder voice than the whispers." And so they began the process of filing a formal motion in court to initiate a harassment claim. Not a civil one, but one backed by documentation, digital trail, and witness statements. Dennis compiled every incident into a cohesive report, structured to demonstrate a deliberate campaign of obstruction. Letitia contacted the state attorney's office, and for the first time, the narrative shifted. Karen was no longer an eccentric neighbor with concerns. She was a suspect in a coordinated effort to manipulate public systems, obstruct property rights, and psychologically harass an individual through indirect but measurable means. When the court date was set, the city buzzed with tension. Karen remained silent, but her circle of allies grew quieter. Some withdrew support. A few distanced themselves outright. Others, realizing their own names might appear in Macy's report, began reaching out to Dennis anonymously, offering to clarify misunderstandings or walk back involvement. Karen, however, didn't flinch. She doubled down, submitting a counterclaim accusing Macy of defamation, malicious disruption, and weaponizing institutional review. It was a last-ditch effort, a legal bluff with no real weight, but it ensured the court proceedings would now involve both parties presenting evidence under oath. That was exactly what Macy wanted, because unlike Karen, she had nothing to hide. And in that courtroom, beneath the sterile lights and the quiet murmur of justice grinding into motion, Macy was not a frightened girl defending a house. She was the plaintiff, armed with truth, documentation, recordings, and the one thing Karen never anticipated: resilience that did not break, but sharpened. The morning of the hearing was unseasonably cold, a sharp wind sweeping across the courthouse steps as Macy approached with Dennis and Letitia flanking her like anchors. She wore the same muted navy blouse Adelaide had once complimented. Buttoned high, pressed and neat, a small gesture of continuity in a world that had done everything to fracture her sense of self. The courthouse was quiet, antiseptic in tone and texture, but Macy felt every detail press against her skin. The way the guard's eyes paused on her face, the sterile shine of the tiled floor, the weight of the file clutched in Dennis's hand. Thick, with testimony and timestamps, audio transcripts, notarized documents, photos, and the recorded interview in which Karen had so casually condemned her without realizing she was building a case against herself. The judge presiding was known for her directness and distaste for dramatics, something Dennis had praised when they reviewed their strategy the night before. This would not be about emotion. It would be about fact, and they had amassed more than enough of it. Karen arrived precisely 3 minutes before the session began, dressed in a charcoal skirt suit with a brooch that gleamed like armor. Her lawyer, a man too young for the false gravitas he tried to wear, trailed behind her carrying only a slim folder. She didn't look at Macy as she took her seat. Not once. She simply sat, back straight, eyes forward, her jaw tight in a way that only the truly cornered could manage. When the case was called, both parties stood. The judge opened with procedural acknowledgments, confirming that the hearing was a civil matter with potential criminal implications pending review. Macy's complaint had been upgraded after the state attorney reviewed Letitia's compiled report and determined that, while not yet meeting the threshold for criminal prosecution, the evidence suggested significant abuse of process and intent to harass through fraudulent use of institutional mechanisms. Karen's counterclaim of defamation was to be heard as part of the same proceeding. Dennis began with a quiet clarity that silenced the courtroom. He laid out the timeline with surgical precision, marking each escalation not with dramatic language but with evidence. Dates, complaints filed, letters received, accounts disrupted, and city processes manipulated. He presented the IP trace on the fraudulent tax photo, the cross-reference between Karen's public volunteer records and the suspicious timing of city service interventions, and the transcript from Letitia's recorded conversation, redacted for privacy, but allowed into evidence for its relevance to the pattern of behavior. The judge asked sharp, methodical questions, dissecting the sequence, identifying motive by context rather than accusation. When Dennis played the recording where Karen said, "Some things you can't inherit, you earn them or you don't belong," the judge paused and scribbled something quickly on her notepad. It was the kind of line that collapsed Karen's entire narrative. Her claim that she had been concerned purely for procedural integrity no longer held weight once it was clear that her motivation stemmed from perceived cultural gatekeeping and personal grievance rather than genuine civic interest. Karen's lawyer attempted to reframe the issue. He argued that community preservation required vigilance, that Karen had a long-standing reputation as someone who protected neighborhood character, and that her actions stemmed from concern, not prejudice. He suggested Macy had failed to assimilate, had ignored social cues, and had used her relationship with Adelaide to leapfrog the communal vetting process. But when the judge asked whether he had any material evidence to suggest Macy had broken any laws or falsified documents, he faltered. When asked to produce a witness who could support Karen's version of events, he hesitated, finally calling a single neighbor who admitted under cross-examination that she had never seen anything firsthand, only heard things. It unraveled fast after that. Then Macy took the stand. She didn't speak like a victim, and she didn't posture like someone seeking pity. She explained with unwavering calm how she had cared for Adelaide, how she had been named heir not because of manipulation but because of trust, and how each action she took after moving in, from paying utility bills to repairing the garden, fence, had been done transparently, legally, and with full respect for the community she now called home. She recounted the night she found the first note, the moment her trash was dumped, the quiet escalation from odd looks to formal inspections. She admitted that the campaign had made her question her sanity at times, but not her right to be there. "I didn't inherit this house by accident," she said. "It wasn't a fluke or a loophole. I was chosen. I earned that trust, and I have the legal, moral, and personal right to stay." When the judge recessed for deliberation, the room remained unnaturally still. Karen, for the first time, looked directly at Macy. Her expression wasn't angry. It was vacant, like a person watching a bridge they burned collapse with no satisfaction, only disbelief. She had expected pushback, but not consequence. She had spent so long using soft influence, whispers, nods, implication, that she had forgotten what it meant to be confronted by immutable truth. The judge returned 15 minutes later with a ruling. She declared that Macy Brooks had been subjected to a sustained and deliberate campaign of interference, harassment, and misrepresentation, that the defendant, Karen Kowalski, had leveraged social influence and unauthorized access to municipal systems to erode the plaintiff's legal rights and quality of life, and that the city's cooperation in processing these false complaints would be reviewed in a separate state inquiry. The judge denied Karen's counterclaim entirely and ordered that she cease all direct or indirect contact with Macy, including initiating third-party complaints or public remarks referencing the plaintiff by inference. Furthermore, the court recognized the potential grounds for criminal review pending the conclusion of the state's administrative investigation into Karen's conduct. Macy didn't react immediately. Her body processed the moment with silence. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She breathed, inhaled deeply, exhaled. And for the first time in months, that breath felt like hers alone. After the session ended, Karen exited the courtroom quickly, flanked by her now muted attorney and a few hesitant supporters who avoided eye contact with anyone not in their fold. Letitia watched them go, then turned to Macy and said quietly, "That wasn't just a win. That was an audit of everything she built." Dennis nodded in agreement. "You didn't just defend yourself. You rewrote the script. She can't do this again, not without the whole town remembering what came before." Macy returned home that afternoon to find her lawn untouched, her porch exactly as she left it, and a note tucked beneath her welcome mat. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't anonymous. It was from the neighbor across the street, the one who used to wave before going quiet. The note was short. "I'm sorry I stayed quiet. You didn't deserve what happened. If you ever need anything, coffee, help with groceries, or just not being alone, knock." Macy folded the note and placed it in the drawer beside Adelaide's letters. She didn't know if she'd ever use it, but it wasn't about the invitation. It was about something else. The shift. The proof that even after all the orchestrated cruelty, the silence, the attacks, the subtle betrayals, truth still had a voice, and she had found hers. The weeks following the court ruling passed not with triumph but with something far quieter, an unfolding stillness that Macy hadn't realized she craved. It wasn't peace, not exactly. The damage Karen had done didn't evaporate overnight, and the neighborhood's rhythm didn't magically reset itself in her favor. But the immediate tension lifted. The mail arrived without tampering. No new complaints or surprise inspections appeared. Deliveries were no longer rerouted or lost. For the first time in months, Macy's life moved forward without invisible hands tugging the thread of her every step. Letitia stayed in contact while the state inquiry into Karen's abusive process moved forward slowly but inevitably. The scope had expanded to include not only the local zoning office but also the Community Historical Society's pattern of informal influence over property transitions, something Macy had always suspected but never thought could be traced. What had begun as a campaign against her had triggered a broader reckoning, one that might take years to complete but would ripple far beyond her individual case. Meanwhile, Karen's world shifted in quieter, more devastating ways. She resigned from her volunteer roles for personal reasons before the formal audit began. Her circle of influence diminished, her supporters becoming scarce shadows of the confidence they once projected. Rumors began to turn inward, about her behavior, about past conflicts re-examined under a new light, about the version of community she had once imposed through charm and menace. And while no criminal charges had yet been filed, the inquiry was not closed. The city attorney's office had requested access to years of archived neighborhood correspondence that Karen had curated, suspecting a broader pattern of exclusion masked by civility. Macy did not rejoice in this. She didn't need to. Watching a force that had once consumed so much of her energy unravel under its own weight was enough. Her focus turned inward, toward recovery, and toward honoring the space that had once belonged to Adelaide, not as a relic, but as a home finally allowed to breathe again. She resumed her quiet routines, repainting the back porch, restoring the garden bed Adelaide had once used for wildflowers, and cataloging the older woman's personal library. Not to sell, not to donate, but to build a corner shelf in the den as a permanent reminder of the woman who had seen something worth protecting in her. She didn't seek out neighbors, but she no longer avoided them either. A few began offering nods again. One brought over a small bag of citrus from her backyard tree. Another knocked, hesitantly, to return a package that had been misdelivered months ago and held onto out of fear or confusion. Macy accepted it with a polite smile, no accusation in her eyes, no anger in her voice. There was no need. The silence of the neighborhood was no longer loaded with judgment. It was simply quiet, open, uncertain, and that was a kind of progress. Dennis closed out the last of the legal paperwork with a final visit, during which he handed Macy a folder and said, "Everything's in your name now, in every database that matters. No more flags, no more disputes. It's yours, officially, permanently." Macy didn't cry, but she gripped the folder tightly and exhaled in a way that felt like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Letitia stopped by that same week, not to deliver documents or updates, but to have coffee on the porch. They spoke of everything and nothing, of family, of work, of what came next. "You'll always have to carry what happened," Letitia said at one point, "but you get to decide what kind of story it becomes, whether it's something that eats at you or something that taught you where your line is." Macy nodded slowly. "It showed me what I'll never tolerate again, and what I'm capable of surviving." As the seasons turned and the city's inquiry faded from the headlines into policy adjustments and administrative reshuffling, Macy remained in the house not as a symbol of defiance, but as someone who had reclaimed the most basic right of all, the right to stay. She didn't need validation. She didn't need redemption. She had lived through the worst kind of exile, the one where you are made to doubt your own legitimacy in the space you rightfully occupy, and she had come out on the other side, intact, scarred but unbroken, and with the knowledge that justice, when demanded and defended persistently, can still work, even in small, deeply personal ways. She planted lavender by the mailbox. She added a second lock to the shed. She left the porch light on every night. And though she never once saw Karen again, not at the market, not walking the block, not in passing cars, she no longer feared what might come from shadows or silence. The worst had come, and she had met it head on, not by shouting louder but by standing still and refusing to be moved. The house was hers. Her story, too.